The morning after the shocking events at Willow House dawned with a reluctant grey, the sun struggling through low, persistent clouds that left a damp chill in the air. Miss Marple, having observed the village wake slowly to the news, brewed her tea with calm precision, her fingers moving almost automatically over the familiar china as her mind worked through the fragments of the previous night. The villagers were beginning to whisper, their conversations tinged with fear and fascination, a mixture Miss Marple knew well. She had always noticed how ordinary people's voices carried their hidden preoccupations, how the smallest glance or hesitation could betray a truth they would never admit aloud. Even the postman, on his early rounds, lingered at the gate to comment on the horror, oblivious to the fact that each word he spoke was itself a clue to the general tenor of the town. By mid-morning, she had wrapped herself in her shawl and walked quietly to the green, observing the subtle shifts in the behavior of those she met. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past with averted gaze, murmuring something about God's justice and the wickedness of the world, while Colonel Forbes loitered near the fountain, his hands clasped behind his back and a faint frown on his brow, clearly replaying the evening's events in his mind. Miss Marple took note of each expression, each shift of posture, each hesitation in speech, filing them away. She knew that human behavior was the most revealing evidence, far more telling than any hastily collected object or misplaced note. Even from a distance, she could discern the tension among the villagers, the way gossip had begun to divide them into factions, each with its own theory of what had occurred at Willow House, and each convinced of its own certainty. Later, she called at the rectory to speak with Reverend Pritchard, whose hands were trembling as he poured her tea, his voice low and quivering. "It was unthinkable," he said, staring at the small sugar bowl. "Who could have imagined such a thing here, at Willow House, of all places?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was gentle and measured. "Indeed, Reverend, but it is often those we least suspect who are capable of deeds we cannot easily comprehend. You must tell me, did anyone seem particularly anxious last evening, anyone whose attention lingered longer on the candles than was customary?" The Reverend frowned, thinking, "I did notice Miss Clegg." She watched the flame of every candle, almost as if measuring its light. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, filing away the observation. A useful detail, perhaps, though not conclusive. Returning to her cottage, she set her basket of errands aside and spread out the few notes she had scribbled in the early hours of the investigation. There was the recollection of the lights flickering, the brief darkness, the muffled crash of a chair, the way several guests had turned instinctively toward the window at the far end of the dining room. Each observation might seem trivial alone, but Miss Marple knew that together they formed a pattern, a subtle map of human response to fear and opportunity. Her knitting lay idle in her lap as she considered the possible sequence of events. The lights had gone out. Someone had moved swiftly and deliberately. Mrs. Ellingham had fallen. The positioning of the furniture suggested a struggle, but not one that involved brute force. Someone had seized the moment to act when attention was diverted, and yet, as she mused, there was a deliberation in the act, a rhythm that implied forethought rather than impulsiveness. By late morning, the village constable called at her door, a young man with the polite but uncertain air of one who had been asked to manage events beyond his comprehension. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've taken statements from all the guests, and everything seems consistent. Though the doctor believes there was poison involved, no one could say who might have had access to the wine at that moment." Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, setting the cup down with deliberate calm. "And yet, Constable, you see, access alone does not indicate opportunity. One must consider character, habits, and the subtle inclinations that lead a person to act when temptation arises. I have noticed certain behaviors among those present that might, if carefully considered, point to someone who understood both the opportunity and the consequence." The constable looked perplexed, nodding politely but clearly unsure what to make of her words. Miss Marple spent the afternoon walking again among the familiar cottages and lanes, listening to the conversations that drifted through open windows, noting the nuances of tone and emphasis. Mrs. Dacres, seated on her porch, spoke openly about the artist, Mr. Vale, with a mixture of curiosity and judgment, while the butcher's wife quietly speculated on Miss Clegg's composure, hinting at knowledge of chemicals or medicines that might have facilitated the crime. Each comment, each gossip-laden speculation became a thread for Miss Marple, a way to trace intentions, fears, and secrets. By the time the sun began to sink behind the trees, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, she returned home, her mind alive with deductions and hypotheses. Sitting by the fire, she reviewed the sequence once more. The lights had failed, the room had fallen into darkness, Mrs. Ellingham had perished, and the subtle actions of a perceptive observer would have been the only path to understanding the truth. She poured herself another cup of tea, her knitting forgotten, and murmured softly to herself. Human nature is never simple. It twists and turns in small gestures, revealing more than any confession could hope to contain. And it is in those small gestures that the true story waits to be found. The quiet ticking of her clock punctuated her thought, and beyond her window, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into the uneasy stillness of a community watching, waiting, and unaware that the first careful steps toward the resolution of the Candlelight Murder were already underway. By mid-morning, the village was alive with the low hum of speculation, a tide of whispered theories and pointed glances that wove through every lane and doorway. Miss Marple, moving at her usual unhurried pace along the familiar paths, observed quietly, her eyes noting subtle gestures and fleeting expressions that others overlooked entirely. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past, clutching her shawl tightly, her lips moving in a silent prayer that seemed more for her own reassurance than for anyone else. Colonel Forbes leaned on his walking stick, frowning at the empty green as though it were guilty of concealing some critical clue. Even children on their way to school looked with furtive curiosity at the ivy-shrouded Willow house, whispering of ghosts and secret poisons with an earnestness that made Miss Marple smile, faintly. Every nuance, she knew, contained a fragment of truth waiting to be assembled. By 11 o'clock, Inspector Craddock had arrived, papers and notebook in hand, exuding a brisk efficiency that masked his underlying curiosity about the case. He had questioned all the guests, he said, yet felt the outlines of the evening remained blurred, as if some invisible hand had shifted the pieces of the puzzle just enough to frustrate easy understanding. Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate calm, offering a small plate of scones, and allowed him to settle into a chair by the fire. "It is certainly a curious case, Miss Marple," he began, "though one that seems to point to no single individual with certainty. Everyone had opportunity, and yet the way the act was carried out—" He hesitated, glancing toward the window. "Well, it required a delicacy of timing that most would lack." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, stirring her tea. "Indeed, Inspector, and that is why one must pay attention not merely to what people do, but to the rhythm of their habits, the little gestures that accompany thought. A hand that trembles, a glance that lingers too long, these are often more revealing than any statement given under questioning." They spoke at length about the sequence of events at Willow House. The sudden extinguishing of the lights, the muffled crash of a chair, the immediate reaction of the guests, and the subtle shifts in position that occurred in the dark. Each detail Miss Marple had noted during the previous evening was now reconsidered in the context of human behavior. "The lights going out," she said softly, "was not mere accident. It offered cover, yes, but only to someone who knew exactly when to act. Observe how most guests froze or sought the nearest support. One, however, had eyes and hands ready, capable of precise movement even in uncertainty. That is significant." Craddock nodded slowly, jotting down the observation. "I did notice that Miss Clegg, for example, did not flinch as much as the others. She seemed prepared." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Prepared, perhaps, but that alone does not tell us motive, does it? By early afternoon, Miss Marple had begun a series of quiet inquiries. She called at the chemist's, ostensibly to collect herbs for her own use, and listened to the clerk recount his recollections of village comings and goings. She inquired casually about recent purchases of chemicals, tonic or medicine, noting names, times, and reactions, while the clerk believed he was merely entertaining polite curiosity. Each response was catalogued mentally, each hesitated syllable a hint, each overemphasized denial a possible confirmation of subtle intent. Then she walked the lanes, speaking briefly to villagers whose children attended the same school as Miss Clegg, learning without overt questioning the nuances of her behavior, her routines, and the peculiar calm with which she had carried herself during the supper. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, carrying a small bundle of notes and observations. She spread them across the table, arranging them in sequences and clusters that made the patterns clearer to her eyes than they would ever appear on paper. She revisited her recollection of the dinner, the placement of chairs, the alignment of guests around the table, the moments in which attention had shifted from one person to another. The flicker of candlelight, the faint smell of wax and burning wicks, the position of wine glasses, all of it mattered. A careful eye could see the order in the apparent chaos, the invisible choreography that led to Mrs. Ellingham's sudden collapse. Her thoughts wandered briefly to human nature. In small villages, pride and fear often dictated action more strongly than any sense of justice. The desire to protect reputation, to maintain appearances, could push a person into decisions that seemed incomprehensible to the outside observer. She considered each guest, imagining what drives and fears might have motivated them in the moment of darkness. The flustered movements of Mrs. Pritchard, the careful steadiness of Miss Clegg, the nervous energy of Mr. Vale, they each left traces that, while minute, were never entirely invisible to someone who observed closely. As twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and sat by the fire, knitting finally forgotten in her lap. She reviewed the sequence of events once more. The lights, the darkness, the fall, the first reactions, and the positioning of each guest. Each piece of behavior, each reaction formed a tapestry that suggested motive, opportunity, and the delicate hand that had acted with precise timing. Somewhere among those guests, someone had orchestrated the tragedy with subtlety, guided by fear or loyalty, or perhaps the desire to conceal an inconvenient truth. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile, not of triumph, but of anticipation. She knew that understanding the human mind was key, that the smallest detail overlooked by others would soon reveal the path to clarity. Outside, the mist thickened over the lanes and cottages, and the village, unaware, continued its rhythm, while inside, an old lady's sharp eyes traced the invisible lines that would ultimately uncover the secret behind the Candlelight Murder at Willow. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a village caught between curiosity and fear, its inhabitants whispering and glancing over shoulders while pretending to tend to ordinary chores. Miss Marple, having observed the subtleties of human behavior for decades, understood that the threads of gossip often revealed as much as direct questioning could, and she set out on a quiet walk through the lanes, noting with meticulous care each gesture, each tone, each hesitation that suggested a concealed truth. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past with her shawl wrapped tightly, muttering prayers under her breath, while Colonel Forbes lingered by the fountain, frowning over the empty green with his hands clasped behind his back, as though replaying every word and action from the night before. Miss Marple's keen eyes, however, were drawn not to the obvious signs of distress, but to the smaller, more telling movements. A finger twisting a glove, a half-hidden glance, the subtle tightening of lips, all of which hinted at anxieties or intentions unspoken. She paused at the corner where the lane opened toward Willow House and watched the servants and gardeners moving with cautious deliberation, avoiding eye contact and exchanging hurried words. The house itself, its ivy thick and dark against the early autumn sky, seemed to hold a somber stillness, a presence that reflected the tension of the evening it had witnessed. Miss Marple, noting the alignment of shutters and the slight unevenness of the lawn, considered the small ways in which those who had been present might have moved through the house during the fatal evening. It was not only what one saw, but how one saw it, she reminded herself, that revealed the essential truths hidden in human actions. By mid-morning, she called at the chemist's shop under the guise of purchasing herbs, while subtly directing the conversation toward recent visitors and the unusual interest some had taken in various chemicals. The young clerk, eager to appear helpful, recounted the minor details without realizing their significance: a purchase of violet ink, questions about cyanide for legitimate purposes in a laboratory, and a few casual remarks regarding Miss Clegg's frequent inquiries. Miss Marple listened with polite attention, asking questions that seemed entirely innocent, yet each answer added a thread to the web she was constructing in her mind. She made no notes, no outward sign of the cataloguing she performed in her head, for she understood that observation itself was a tool more powerful than any written record. As the afternoon progressed, she called on a few neighbors under the pretense of exchanging recipes and small talk. Mrs. Dacres spoke freely about Mr. Vale, remarking on his composure during the supper and the odd absence of alarm when the lights went out, while Mrs. Pritchard recounted, with thinly veiled anxiety, the small ways in which Miss Clegg had appeared unusually focused, almost as if she anticipated the moments when darkness would provide cover. Each observation was noted, each anomaly considered not in isolation but in relation to others. Miss Marple reflected on how human motives, fear, loyalty, pride, and self-interest interacted, and how those interactions often left traces more indelible than any physical evidence. Returning to her cottage as the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, Miss Marple placed her shopping basket on the table and settled into her favorite chair by the fire. The light outside had softened, turning the village lanes into muted channels of gray and gold, and she could hear the faint clatter of shutters and the distant voice of a child calling a dog. She reviewed the sequence of the previous evening in her mind. The moment the lights went out, the sound of the chair tipping, the reactions of each guest, the placement of hands, the subtle movements of those who were calm and those who were not. The evidence lay not only in what had been done, but in how it had been done, and in that how, Miss Marple had learned, the truth often resided. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the question of motive. Access, opportunity, and timing were all relevant, but it was the interplay of emotions, the fears and loyalties hidden beneath polite manners, that would provide the key to understanding the murder. A person acting out of fear, for instance, might leave traces in hesitation or a misaligned object, while someone acting deliberately would leave more subtle, controlled signs. Miss Marple considered the patterns she had observed, the way Miss Clegg had handled objects during the brief darkness, the careful positioning of Mr. Vale near the table, and the barely perceptible tightening of Mrs. Pritchard's expression at key moments. By evening, the inspector arrived at her door, carrying his notebook in a polite but perplexed air. He detailed the statements taken, the confirmations of opportunity, and the seemingly impossible precision of the act itself. Miss Marple, listening patiently, interjected at intervals with gentle questions and observations, drawing attention not to physical evidence but to the human behaviors that accompanied the events. She noted, without accusation, the discrepancies between claimed recollections and small verifiable actions. A hand resting too long on a glass, a glance toward a corner of the room, the subtle way someone's body shifted in reaction to another's words. The inspector's brow furrowed, his habitual efficiency tempered by the realization that the truth might lie in subtleties he had not fully appreciated. Miss Marple, finally, allowed herself a small smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet anticipation. She knew the next steps would require patience, careful observation, and the willingness to see what others overlooked. Outside, the last of the sunlight faded, leaving the village bathed in soft shadow, and within her small cottage, she prepared herself for the delicate work of unraveling human motives, confident that the smallest gestures would soon illuminate the path to the solution of the Candlelight Murder at Willow. By the following morning, the village had settled into a tense and uneasy calm, with the events at Willow House still circulating from cottage to cottage in murmured speculation. Miss Marple, noticing the subtle shifts in demeanor as she walked the familiar lanes, was keenly aware that the answers would not be found in noise or confession, but in the quiet patterns of human behavior. She paused briefly outside the post office, observing the way Mrs. Hartnell greeted neighbors with an extra caution in her voice, her eyes flicking over shoulders as though afraid someone might overhear her words. The butcher's wife, conversely, whispered more freely, spinning conjecture about Mr. Vale's intentions and Miss Clegg's composure, and though she was unaware, each half-truth she offered added pieces to a mental mosaic Miss Marple was already assembling. The old lady's keen eyes also noticed the nervous fiddling of hands, the slight tilts of heads, and the almost imperceptible tensions in posture that marked where guilt, fear, or curiosity lurked beneath outward composure. Miss Marple spent much of the morning in her small study, sorting through the subtle impressions she had gathered. She recalled the dining room at Willow House, the flickering candlelight, the momentary darkness, the soft crash of the chair, and the precise reactions of each guest. Certain details, previously dismissed as trivial, now stood out. The faint smudge on the wine decanter, the slight shift of a chair that should have remained still, the way Miss Clegg had subtly adjusted her hands, even while appearing to be shocked. Opportunity without intention is not enough, Miss Marple murmured to herself. But intention without opportunity is meaningless, and some know how to seize both. She poured herself a cup of tea, the gentle steam curling in the quiet room, as her mind traced the invisible threads connecting gesture, motive, and chance. By mid-morning, she had ventured toward Willow House under the pretense of calling on a neighbor, while in truth intending to observe the manor from a discreet distance. The garden appeared tranquil, though the trimmed hedges and well-tended paths seemed to reflect a nervous attention to detail, a household striving for appearances while concealing the undercurrents of fear and suspicion. She noted the slight unevenness of the paving stones near the back door, a subtle mark that suggested someone had returned hurriedly during the night or early morning. It was the sort of detail others would overlook, but Miss Marple understood that even a fleeting movement left its mark in the physical world, just as human emotion left its imprint on faces and actions. As she returned along the lane, she encountered Mr. Vale walking briskly in the opposite direction, his brow furrowed and his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. He attempted a polite greeting, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, as though he were carefully measuring his words against some unseen standard. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, noting the tension in the set of his shoulders, the slight hesitation in his step. "People rarely act without reason, Mr. Vale," she said lightly, almost as an afterthought, "and the smallest incident can reveal the deepest secret if observed closely." He responded with a nervous smile, too quick to be convincing, and hurried on, leaving Miss Marple to reflect on the subtle signals of fear and defensiveness that marked him as someone whose involvement, whether direct or indirect, could not be dismissed. By noon, Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage with papers and a determined expression, eager to compare notes and discuss the evidence gathered so far. He outlined the alibis of the guests, the sequence of events during the brief blackout, and the doctor's observations regarding the suspected poison. Miss Marple listened quietly, asking pointed questions about gestures, hesitations, and minor inconsistencies that might escape even a careful inspector's notice. "It is not always what is said, Inspector, but what is done between the words," she remarked. "The true story often reveals itself in the rhythm of human action, in the inconspicuous choices made under pressure. You may find that those who appear calm and measured have reason to conceal more than they admit." Craddock nodded thoughtfully, scribbling in his notebook, recognizing that the investigation required more than routine observation. It demanded a sensitive reading of character, of habit, of the interplay between opportunity and motive. In the afternoon, Miss Marple visited the chemist's under the pretense of collecting herbs and innocuous items. Yet her attention was firmly on the small details of transactions and questions. The clerk mentioned Miss Clegg's inquiries regarding violet ink, and she noted the subtle overemphasis in his voice when he mentioned Mr. Vale asking about cyanide in legitimate quantities. Each small confession, each inadvertent slip, added to the mosaic forming in her mind. She then walked slowly back through the village, greeting acquaintances and listening to the whispers that floated from open windows, mentally cataloguing inconsistencies and unspoken concerns. By evening, she returned home to her quiet cottage, setting down her basket and arranging her notes with care. The sequence of events unfolded clearly before her, each action interlinked with motive and circumstance. The minor gestures, the overlooked movements, the tension in voices, and the faint traces left on surfaces created a pattern that would eventually reveal the person who had acted deliberately in the darkness. Sitting by the fire, knitting abandoned, Miss Marple allowed herself a soft smile, knowing that patience, observation, and the careful weighing of human nature would soon bring clarity. Outside, the village darkened beneath a growing mist, yet inside, an old lady's sharp mind traced every invisible line, preparing for the moment when the subtle threads of action and intention would converge to expose the truth behind the Candlelight Murder at Willow. The next morning brought a thin mist that clung to the cottages and hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, giving the village an almost ethereal quality as Miss Marple made her customary early walk. She paused frequently, observing the subtle signs of unease that had taken root among the villagers. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past, clutching her coat more tightly than necessary, her lips moving in a soft, unceasing murmur of prayer, while Colonel Forbes leaned against a gatepost, hands clasped behind his back, frowning thoughtfully as though attempting to reconstruct every detail of the supper in his mind. Even children on their way to school glanced toward Willow House with quiet curiosity, whispering of shadowy figures and whispered secrets. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn to smaller, less obvious signals: the brief twitch of a hand, the hesitancy of a glance, the tilt of a head, subtle markers of thought and emotion that often betrayed far more than words. By mid-morning, she paid a visit to Willow House, ostensibly to deliver a small basket of preserves to the household. Yet with an attentive eye, she noted the careful tidiness of the drawing-room, the faint trace of a chair shifted slightly from its usual position, and the subtle tension in the posture of the remaining servants. It was in these small details that she discerned the echoes of last night's disturbances. Each placement, each adjustment, hinted at an anxiety the household could not openly acknowledge, a ripple in their otherwise precise routine. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. Such small signs were often more revealing than confession. Returning to the village green, she encountered Mr. Vale, whose hurried step and tense expression suggested thoughts she could only guess at. He attempted a casual greeting, yet his eyes flickered nervously as he measured her response. Miss Marple, with gentle amusement, observed the signs of unease: the quick adjustment of his coat, the fleeting glance over his shoulder, the way his voice, though controlled, lacked the ease he had attempted to project. "People act according to habits," she murmured quietly to herself, "and habits reveal intentions far sooner than words do." Her calm demeanor drew no suspicion, Yet she filed each movement and glance into her mental ledger, noting the subtleties that marked character under pressure. Later, she visited the chemist's shop once more, again under the pretense of routine errands, while she subtly gathered information on recent purchases and inquiries. The clerk mentioned Miss Clegg's interest in certain chemicals, asked in a manner that seemed innocuous, but was accompanied by a subtle tension in his expression. Mr. Vale's prior questions about cyanide in legitimate quantities were also recounted, framed as casual curiosity, yet Miss Marple knew better. Human nature, she reflected, often sought to obscure truth through appearances of innocence, and the challenge was to trace the invisible thread connecting these small acts to the events at Willow House. Each detail, each hesitation, added texture to the picture she was constructing, an image of intention and opportunity woven together in ways the police might overlook. By afternoon, she called on Mrs. Dacres and a few other neighbors, ostensibly for social conversation, yet she was attentive to every remark and expression. Mrs. Dacres noted Mr. Vale's calm during the blackout, as though he had been aware of what was to come, while Mrs. Pritchard recounted Miss Clegg's watchful attention, her calm composure, in moments that had unsettled others. Miss Marple listened with polite attentiveness, committing each subtle nuance to memory, considering how these behaviors intersected with access, opportunity, and motive. It was not merely action that mattered, but the timing and deliberation behind it, the quiet decisions made in the shadow of circumstance. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, laying her basket aside and arranging the various notes and observations she had collected. The evidence, she reflected, was not in confessions or physical objects alone, but in the interplay of gesture, reaction, and emotion. The way a chair had tipped, the faint mark on the carpet, the precise placement of glasses and cutlery all contributed to a pattern that was slowly emerging. Each element of human behavior was a clue, each reaction a potential revelation, and Miss Marple allowed herself the calm satisfaction of seeing connections others might have missed entirely. Sitting by the fire, she reviewed the day in her mind, the subtle nervousness of Mr. Vale, the measured composure of Miss Clegg, the visible anxiety of Mrs. Pritchard, the faint disarray at Willow House, all details that, when considered together, began to form a picture of the sequence that led to Mrs. Ellingham's death. She considered motive, opportunity, and the small telling signs that revealed a person's true inclinations under stress. Patience, observation, and careful attention to the human mind were the tools she relied upon, and in the quiet of her cottage, she felt the invisible threads beginning to converge. The village darkened beneath a soft, settling mist, and the lamplight flickered along the lanes. Within her cozy home, Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and discerning, traced each line of behavior, each subtle interaction, confident that the careful assembly of these small but telling details would soon illuminate the path to understanding the Candlelight Murder at Willow. She sipped her tea, hands folded in her lap, allowing the patterns to coalesce, knowing that while the village remained unaware of the true significance of what she observed, the solution was already beginning to take shape, guided by quiet intellect, patient deduction, and an unerring insight into human nature. The next morning, a crisp chill hung in the air as Miss Marple walked slowly through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, her eyes catching the slightest shifts in posture and expression among the villagers. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past, muttering prayers and clutching her bag tightly, while Colonel Forbes lingered near the green, frowning and muttering to himself, as though retracing the events at Willow House over and over. Even children, skipping along to school, whispered tales of shadows and mysterious figures, their wide eyes glancing toward the ivy-covered manor, and Miss Marple noted every pause, every flicker of curiosity or anxiety. She understood that each of these subtle behaviors contained clues, not to the overt acts of the previous evening, but to the hidden currents of motive and fear that underpinned them. Small details, unnoticed by most, were the real threads from which the pattern of truth could be woven. By mid-morning, she made her way to Willow House under the pretense of delivering a small basket of preserves, though in truth she wished to observe the household's atmosphere and note the subtleties of movement and reaction. The servants bustled quietly, careful to maintain the usual routines, yet Miss Marple discerned a slight tension in the set of their shoulders, a nervous precision in the arrangement of silverware and chairs. Even the faint misalignment of a tablecloth, corrected with exaggerated care, spoke volumes about the residual unease that had taken hold. She allowed her gaze to linger on the pattern of shadows in the hall, the faint mark left by a chair that had been hastily moved, all the while maintaining a demeanor of casual politeness that concealed the acuity of her observations. Returning to the village green, she noticed Mr. Vale approaching, his steps quick and measured, and his expression betraying a hint of unease beneath the composed exterior. He attempted a casual greeting, but his eyes darted briefly toward the hedgerows, as if calculating a course or assessing unseen observers. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, noting the tension in his hands, the faint tremor in his voice, and the careful control he exerted over his gestures. One can learn much about a person by observing the rhythm of their movements, she murmured to herself. Even the smallest act, repeated or restrained, leaves a trace of truth. She watched him pass, cataloguing every nuance, knowing that later each detail might form a crucial link in the chain of deduction. By noon, she visited the chemist, ostensibly for herbs and remedies, yet her attention was wholly on the conversation. The clerk mentioned Miss Clegg's repeated inquiries regarding certain chemical substances, phrased as casual interest, but his voice held a subtle tension that spoke to his awareness of their significance. Mr. Vale's previous questions about cyanide in legitimate forms were also recounted, described as mere curiosity, yet Miss Marple discerned the implications. These were small, seemingly innocent acts that, when considered in the context of opportunity and timing, began to suggest intentionality. She departed quietly, her mind assembling the fragments of behavior into a coherent picture, noting how human nature often sought to disguise intention beneath politeness and routine. In the afternoon, she visited several neighbors under the guise of social conversation, collecting observations on their recollections and interpretations of the evening. Mrs. Dacres spoke freely of Mr. Vale's composure, remarking how he seemed aware of the sequence of events, while Mrs. Pritchard highlighted Miss Clegg's extraordinary calm when darkness fell. Miss Marple listened with polite attention, making no outward sign of her mental notes, yet every word, gesture, and hesitation was carefully filed. She understood that motive often revealed itself in fleeting expressions. A tightened lip, a sudden glance, the careful choice of words, all subtle markers of thought and feeling that most would dismiss. As dusk approached, she returned to her cottage, placing her collected notes on the table and arranging them into sequences of observed behavior and potential significance. She revisited the evening in her mind. The extinguished lights, the crash of a chair, the faint smell of wax and wine, the placement of hands and objects. Each reaction, each measured or unmeasured gesture, contributed to a pattern that suggested the presence of careful planning and deliberate action. Miss Marple reflected on how ordinary people, when pushed by circumstance or opportunity, could reveal extraordinary insight into character, and in those small revelations lay the path to understanding. Sitting by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap, she reviewed the subtle cues she had gathered, Mr. Vale's nervous glances, Miss Clegg's precise movements, the faint anxiety evident in Mrs. Pritchard, the meticulous adjustments at Willow House. Each detail, insignificant in isolation, formed a network of interactions that began to illuminate the truth behind Mrs. Ellingham's death. Patience, Observation and careful interpretation of human behavior were her tools, and Miss Marple felt the invisible threads coalescing into a pattern that would, in due course, guide her toward the solution. Outside, the village was enveloped in a gentle mist, the lanterns casting long shadows across quiet lanes, while within the modest cottage, an old lady's sharp mind traced every subtle line of human action, preparing for the moment when careful deduction would illuminate the candlelight murder at Willow. By the early morning, St. Mary Mead carried a hush that seemed to settle even over the birds in the hedgerows, a cautious stillness that reflected the lingering unease from the previous night's events. Miss Marple walked along the familiar lanes at her usual deliberate pace, noting the subtle cues that might reveal the undercurrents of tension among the villagers. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past, her coat tightly wrapped and her hands clasped over a small bundle, muttering prayers under her breath, while Colonel Forbes lingered near the green, hands behind his back, frowning in concentrated thought as though replaying every gesture and word at Willow House in his mind. Children whispered to one another as they passed, glancing furtively at the ivy-shrouded manor, yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn less to the overt fear and more to the quieter signals. The tightening of a jaw, the brief shift in posture, the way eyes met and avoided one another. It was in these small, often unnoticed details that the truth frequently revealed itself. By mid-morning, she visited Willow House under the pretense of delivering a small basket of preserves, though in reality she wished to observe the household in the quiet aftermath of the tragedy. The servants moved with careful precision, tending to the rooms as if aware that even the smallest misstep could betray the lingering tension. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the drawing-room, noting a slight tilt in the positioning of a chair, the uneven arrangement of cutlery, and a faint smudge on the polished table, a trace of hurried movement that might have gone unnoticed by anyone less attentive. She observed the way the young maid adjusted her hands repeatedly, attempting to hide tremors of anxiety, and the subtle hesitation of the housekeeper as she set down a tray, all minute markers of emotions the villagers had yet to articulate. Miss Marple allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that such signs, though invisible to most, were far more telling than any spoken statement. On her way back, she encountered Mr. Vale, walking briskly with his coat collar turned up against the chill. His greeting was polite but restrained, his eyes flicking briefly toward the hedgerows and then away, as if gauging whether he was being watched. Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the quick adjustment of his hat, and the controlled modulation of his voice, all signs of someone accustomed to managing perception and concealing unease. She made a casual remark about the weather, deliberately observing his reaction, and noted how his expression flickered almost imperceptibly, betraying the calm he attempted to project. These fleeting signals, she knew, often held more significance than the elaborate alibis and explanations that would later be offered. By late morning, she visited the village chemist, ostensibly for herbs and remedies, yet she carefully steered the conversation toward recent inquiries and purchases. The young clerk recounted Miss Clegg's repeated questions about certain chemicals, delivered in a tone of innocent curiosity, but tinged with nervousness, and also mentioned Mr. Vale's inquiries regarding cyanide in legally permissible quantities. Each of these seemingly trivial incidents Miss Marple catalogued silently, noting the small inconsistencies and emphasis in the clerk's tone that suggested unspoken significance. She understood well that human nature tended to obscure culpability beneath manners and routine. Yet subtle behaviors often betrayed intention before anyone spoke a word. In the early afternoon, she called on several neighbors, ostensibly for friendly conversation, but in truth listening intently to their recollections and observations. Mrs. Dacres commented on Mr. Vale's unusual calm during the blackout, suggesting a familiarity with moments of tension that unsettled others, while Mrs. Pritchard highlighted Miss Clegg's extraordinary composure, describing her as eerily steady when the room had gone dark. Miss Marple listened with polite attentiveness, storing every nuance, every hesitation, and every inflection, knowing that these small indicators were often more revealing than any formal evidence collected by the authorities. She began to draw the contours of motive and opportunity from behaviors alone, trusting the patterns to reveal the truth when assembled carefully. As dusk approached, she returned to her cottage, laying her observations out on the table and considering the interactions of the evening and the following day. She traced in her mind the extinguished lights, the subtle sounds of movement in the dark, the minor disruptions of chairs and objects, and the precise positioning of hands and bodies. Each small gesture, whether nervous, controlled, or inadvertent, contributed to a growing map of intentions and opportunities. Miss Marple understood that patience, combined with a careful eye for human behavior, would bring clarity to the incident at Willow House. Sitting by the fire, she allowed the faint glow of candlelight to illuminate her notes, reviewing the delicate interplay of character, motive, and circumstance. Mr. Vale's careful monitoring of his surroundings, Miss Clegg's poised movements, the servants' anxious adjustments, and the villagers' whispered concerns all began to interlock in patterns that spoke louder than any words. Outside, the mist thickened across the village, softening the outlines of hedgerows and cottages, while inside, an old lady's keen mind traced every subtle line and nuance of human behavior, confident that each overlooked gesture and fleeting glance would soon converge to reveal the truth behind the candlelight murder at Willow. By the following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead had adopted a wary, watchful air, as if even the birds and the rustling leaves understood that something extraordinary had recently disturbed their routine. Miss Marple, taking her habitual early walk along the familiar lanes, noted the subtle signs of tension in her neighbors' movements. Mrs. Pritchard hurried by with her hands tightly clasped around her shawl, murmuring prayers that barely masked her nervous curiosity, while Colonel Forbes stood near the green with a furrowed brow, muttering observations to himself as he replayed the previous night's events in his mind. Even children whispered and glanced furtively toward Willow House, their steps slowed by the shadow of the incident. Miss Marple's attention, however, was not drawn to the overt signs of unease, but to the smaller, often overlooked gestures. A hand twisting a glove nervously, a half-hidden glance, a sudden, cautious shift in posture. Such subtleties, she knew, were far more revealing than words or confessions. By mid-morning, she made a careful detour past Willow House, ostensibly to visit a neighbor, though her true aim was to observe the household from a discreet distance. The ivy-clad manor appeared deceptively tranquil, its gardens meticulously tended, but carrying an almost imperceptible rigidity, as though the very hedges had absorbed the tension of the previous evening. Miss Marple noticed the slight misalignment of a paving stone near the back door, the faint mark on the lawn that suggested a hurried step, and the subtle way the curtains had been adjusted with exaggerated precision. Even the servants' movements betrayed their apprehension. Hands lingering too long over trays, the faint quiver of shoulders, an abrupt pause in conversation. Each detail, no matter how insignificant it appeared, fed into the mental picture Miss Marple was carefully assembling, a tapestry of behavior and circumstance that would eventually illuminate the truth. Walking back through the village, she encountered Mr. Vale, who passed briskly, attempting a courteous nod while his eyes flickered with a tension he could not entirely conceal. Miss Marple observed the slight stiffness in his stride, the nervous adjustment of his coat, the careful modulation of his voice, noting how these controlled gestures betrayed unease. She allowed a faint, polite remark to escape her lips, carefully gauging his reaction. People often reveal more in the management of their movements than in the words they speak, she mused quietly. Mr. Vale's brief, almost imperceptible hesitation before replying confirmed her suspicion that appearances alone were insufficient. Intent and emotion left traces far subtler than casual observation might detect. Later that morning, she visited the village chemist, ostensibly for herbs, while directing the conversation toward recent inquiries and purchases. The young clerk mentioned Miss Clegg's repeated questions about particular chemicals, phrased in an innocent manner, yet accompanied by the clerk's slight tension, a subtle acknowledgment of their significance. Mr. Vale's inquiries regarding cyanide in legally permissible quantities were also recalled, presented casually, but Miss Marple recognized the deliberate avoidance of implication. Such minor acts, she knew, often concealed the most telling intentions, and the arrangement of these seemingly trivial details already suggested a pattern emerging in the shadows of Willow House. In the afternoon, Miss Marple called on several neighbors under the guise of social conversation, while carefully listening for their recollections and interpretations of the night's events. Mrs. Dacres commented on Mr. Vale's unusual calm when the lights had failed, implying an almost preternatural awareness of the evening's sequence, whereas Mrs. Pritchard highlighted Miss Clegg's composure, noting how she had seemed eerily steady when others had been unsettled. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting each hesitation, each fleeting glance, and every inflection in tone, storing them in her mind for careful analysis. The small clues she gathered were invisible to most, but formed the foundation for understanding motives, timing, and opportunity. As the late afternoon sun softened, she returned to her cottage and began arranging the subtle impressions of the day into coherent sequences. She traced, in thought, the extinguished candles, the soft clatter of a chair, the slight shifts of objects, and the measured movements of hands and bodies. Each gesture, whether deliberate, controlled, or accidental, contributed to an intricate network of human behavior. She considered how fear, loyalty, and hidden intentions intertwined to shape actions, and she sensed that the invisible threads connecting them were slowly drawing her closer to the heart of the mystery. Sitting by the fire, Miss Marple reviewed the day's observations. Mr. Vale's careful monitoring of his surroundings, Miss Clegg's precise, almost practiced movements, the servants' anxious adjustments, and the subtle, restless behavior of the villagers. Each piece of behavior, while individually minor, formed a complex pattern pointing toward hidden intentions and potential culpability. Outside, the village lanes were wrapped in mist, and the glow of lanterns cast long, soft shadows. Yet inside the modest cottage, an old lady's sharp mind traced every nuance and subtle signal. She knew that with patience and keen observation, the accumulated human evidence would soon converge, revealing the carefully concealed truth behind the Candlelight Murder at Willow and exposing the intricacies of deception woven into the night's events. The following morning, St. Mary Mead was cloaked in a fine, lingering mist that softened the outlines of cottages and hedgerows, giving the village an almost surreal stillness. Miss Marple set out along the familiar paths with her usual deliberate pace, eyes scanning the subtle movements and interactions that spoke more than words ever could. Mrs. Pritchard hurried past, clutching her reticule tightly as though it might contain some talisman against misfortune, murmuring prayers with a nervous cadence, while Colonel Forbes lingered near the village green, hands clasped behind his back, lips moving silently as he reconstructed each detail of the evening at Willow House in his mind. Children skipped past in cautious whispers, glancing toward the ivy-clad manor, yet it was the faint, almost imperceptible signs, the tilting of heads, the fleeting shifts of posture, the nervous adjustment of gloves that drew Miss Marple's attention. Such small behaviors, she knew, often betrayed intentions and anxieties far more reliably than the elaborate alibis or reassurances that accompanied them. By mid-morning, she approached Willow House again under the guise of visiting a neighbor, though her true aim was to observe the household from a discreet vantage. The manor presented an air of careful serenity, yet subtle traces of unrest were present for one who knew where to look. The hedges, though neatly trimmed, seemed unnaturally stiff. The paving stones near the back door bore faint marks as though someone had trodden there hastily, and the curtains had been arranged with almost obsessive precision. The servants moved with meticulous care, betraying slight tremors of apprehension in their hands and shoulders as they performed routine tasks. Even the faintly crooked alignment of a chair or the delicate repositioning of cutlery spoke of lingering unease, and Miss Marple noted each observation silently, her mind weaving these fragments into an emerging portrait of the household's psychological state. As she retraced her steps back into the village, she encountered Mr. Vale, who passed with measured stride, offering a polite nod that seemed almost automatic, his eyes briefly flicking toward the hedgerows before returning to the path ahead. Miss Marple's gaze followed the subtle tension in his movements, the controlled modulation of his voice, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, the rapid adjustment of his hat. "Actions reveal what words conceal," she murmured to herself, noting how even those most practiced in composure could not entirely suppress the traces of unease that lingered in every gesture. Mr. Vale's brief hesitation before replying to her casual comment confirmed the presence of an underlying preoccupation, one she was determined to understand fully before forming conclusions. By late morning, she called at the village chemist under the pretext of purchasing herbs and innocuous remedies, but her mind focused on the discussion of recent inquiries. The young clerk mentioned Miss Clegg's repeated questions about certain chemicals, phrased as casual curiosity, yet delivered with a subtle tension that hinted at more than simple interest. Mr. Vale's inquiries into legally permissible quantities of cyanide were also recounted, framed as innocent, but Miss Marple's keen attention caught the slightest inflections that suggested deliberate concealment. She filed these details mentally, noting that human intention often left delicate traces, visible only to one who knew how to observe. In the afternoon, she visited a few neighbors, ostensibly to maintain social niceties, yet she listened with concentrated attention as they described their recollections of the previous night. Mrs. Dacres remarked on Mr. Vale's remarkable calm during the blackout, implying an awareness beyond ordinary perception, while Mrs. Pritchard dwelled on Miss Clegg's unwavering composure, noting the eerie steadiness with which she had acted while others had been unsettled. Miss Marple catalogued each nuance, every hesitation, glance, and inflection, understanding that these minor behavioral cues often revealed more than statements of fact. The small, almost invisible signs of human nature, she observed, were gradually mapping a network of motive, opportunity, and psychological tension that would ultimately illuminate the mystery. As twilight descended, she returned to her cottage, spreading her observations before her and arranging them into a coherent sequence. She reviewed in her mind the extinguished candles, the soft sounds of chairs shifting, the precise movements of hands and bodies, and the faint but telling traces left on surfaces in the dim light. Each gesture, whether intentional, controlled, or inadvertent, contributed to a growing pattern that suggested a careful orchestration behind the events at Willow House. Miss Marple understood that human nature, when combined with opportunity and motive, left subtle signatures for one who cared to see. Sitting quietly by the fire, she contemplated the collected evidence of behavior and circumstance. Mr. Vale's tense vigilance, Miss Clegg's poised control, the servants' anxious adjustments, and the villagers' muted curiosities. Each small detail, when considered in combination, hinted at hidden intentions and potential culpability, forming a network of clues invisible to those less observant. Outside, the village lanes were softened by the gathering mist, lamplight casting long, diffuse shadows across the path, while inside, an old lady's penetrating mind traced every nuance of expression, gesture, and hesitation, confident that patience, careful observation, and a meticulous reading of human nature would soon reveal the truth behind the candlelight murder at Willow and expose the hidden threads of deception woven through that fateful night. The following morning arrived with a crisp clarity, the mist that had shrouded St. Mary Mead lifting to reveal the neat hedgerows and familiar lanes that usually seemed so tranquil. Miss Marple, walking with her customary unhurried pace, carried a quiet certainty in her step. The previous day's observations had converged in her mind like carefully arranged threads, each small behavior and subtle gesture forming a coherent pattern that no outward evidence could reveal so distinctly. As she passed the village green, she saw Mrs. Pritchard fussing over her garden with an anxious precision, glancing repeatedly toward Willow House, and Colonel Forbes standing thoughtfully by the gate, the weight of his own speculations visible in the furrow of his brow. Children hurried by, whispering and giggling, yet even in their playfulness there was a sense of curiosity tinged with unease, a reflection of the general tension in the village. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to linger, quietly noting the rhythms of their actions, the slight hesitations, the small but revealing pauses. These human nuances, she reflected, often betrayed intentions far more clearly than any statement or confession could. She approached Willow House under the pretense of delivering a small parcel, though in truth her visit was an opportunity to observe and, if necessary, to provoke reactions. The household was calm, almost unnervingly so, the servants moving with mechanical precision, yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted inconsistencies. A misplaced object, a faint smudge on a polished surface, a hurried adjustment of curtains or a chair slightly askew. Each anomaly was a signal, a silent admission of disturbance, and she catalogued them in her mind with patient care. She observed the behavior of those present, noting how Miss Clegg handled tasks with calm efficiency, yet her eyes flickered occasionally with a tension that spoke of inward calculation. Mr. Vale's composure, though outwardly unshakable, held the slightest tremor in gesture and expression, a subtle betrayal of the controlled image he sought to present. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had arranged a casual meeting with a few villagers, ostensibly to discuss mundane matters, but the conversation was carefully guided. She spoke of the candlelight supper, the blackout, and the minor disturbances, listening with keen attention to reactions. Mrs. Dacres, in recounting Mr. Vale's calm, seemed almost unconsciously to reveal admiration mingled with suspicion, while Mrs. Pritchard's commentary on Miss Clegg's steadiness hinted at awareness of something more than mere presence. Each narrative, each choice of word, every involuntary glance or change in posture contributed pieces to the invisible puzzle. Miss Marple's serene demeanor encouraged openness while concealing the depth of her understanding, allowing her to gather insights that would otherwise remain hidden. By the early afternoon, she returned to Willow House under the guise of social call, engaging Miss Clegg and Mr. Vale in gentle, seemingly casual conversation. Miss Marple's questions were innocuous yet strategically placed, designed to draw forth small, revealing reactions. She asked about the placement of chairs, the arrangement of the table, the order of serving, all trivial matters on the surface, but each prompted a subtle signal, an eye darting, a hand trembling, a slight flush that confirmed suspicions already forming in her mind. Observing closely, she noted how Mr. Vale's composure faltered for the briefest of moments, and how Miss Clegg's poised exterior masked a tension she could not entirely suppress. Miss Marple's quiet observation was her most potent tool. By watching and listening rather than accusing, she allowed the suspects to reveal themselves in their own actions. As evening approached, Miss Marple arranged for the gathering of villagers under a pretense of community discussion, ensuring the presence of those most involved: Mr. Vale, Miss Clegg, Mrs. Pritchard, and Colonel Forbes. She spoke gently of the events at Willow House, leading conversation toward subtle contradictions, inconsistencies, and points of tension. With calm and unobtrusive skill, she encouraged reactions that, to the casual observer, might seem incidental but were in fact telling. Mr. Vale, who had attempted to project complete control, showed a brief but unmistakable flicker of unease when certain details were mentioned. Miss Clegg's gaze shifted momentarily, betraying an anxiety she could not entirely conceal. Miss Marple, with serene composure, allowed the observations to accumulate, the pieces falling into place with quiet inevitability. Finally, she addressed the assembled villagers with a gentle firmness, her voice calm yet carrying the weight of certainty. She recounted the events of the candlelight supper, highlighting not merely what had occurred, but the subtle patterns of behavior she had observed, the nervous adjustments, the fleeting gestures, the involuntary signals that revealed truth beyond appearances. She traced the sequence of actions, the timing, and the concealed motives, showing how each clue fit into an intricate but coherent picture. Slowly, deliberately, she revealed that it was Miss Clegg who had orchestrated the disruption, using careful planning and manipulation of circumstance to mask her intentions, while Mr. Vale's unwitting involvement had been a red herring exploited to divert suspicion. The villagers listened in quiet astonishment, realizing that the calm, polite exterior of both suspects had concealed an entirely different reality, and that only a mind attuned to human nature could have discerned the truth. As the truth settled over the group, the tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a mixture of relief, surprise, and reflection. Miss Marple's quiet smile, her calm yet penetrating insight, had unveiled the hidden patterns behind the candlelight murder at Willow, revealing the intricate web of deceit, human weakness, and concealed motives that had brought the village to its moment of crisis. Outside, the evening shadows stretched across the village lanes, mist softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows. Yet within Willow House, understanding and resolution had been restored. Miss Marple, serene and observant, reflected on the predictable complexities of human behavior and the quiet, patient work required to uncover truth, confident that the village would slowly return to its ordinary rhythms, though forever subtly marked by the events she had unraveled.